So in this video we're going to continue to build out this set piece. In the last video we carved out the ground plane using a white bead foam. Now we're going to cover it in strips of burlap that have been dipped in a water and Elmer's glue mixture, and this is just going to create a hard shell on top of the styrofoam. I'm also going to talk a little bit about forced perspective and how I made this mountain range that's going to be in the background. So after the last video, I went ahead and sculpted the tree that fits into this set. I had to make some modifications to the foam to make sure that it was at the right angle and height, and now I'm ready to move on to the burlap. I'm a big fan of burlap because it's a super cheap material. These were all burlap bags that I just had lying around in the studio. I cut all the seams off of them. I left them out in the rain for a few days to kind of flatten them out, and then I just cut them into a bunch of different size strips. In a bucket I mixed up some Elmer's glue with water. This is about a 3-to-1 ratio, 1 part Elmer's glue, 3 parts water. Then I dip the burlap strips into the bucket and wring it out a few times and then just start laying it across the foam. I try to overlap the pieces a little bit and lay them down in different directions. It's definitely a good idea to have a plastic tarp on the floor here because glue will drip everywhere. Burlap's a pretty heavy material, so I really try to squish it around in the bucket to really make sure that it gets saturated with the glue. So after I completely cover the foam with one layer, I go back and do a second layer. With the second layer, I just try to cover the seams of the first layer, and I really just try to mix up the directions of all of the burlap scraps. I'm also cutting out a little hole where the tree is going to sit. I might want to go back in later and carve some of that out a little bit more, so I definitely want to have access to that spot. After I get 2 solid layers of burlap on, I mix up another bucket of Elmer's glue and water. This one's a little bit thicker, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. And this one I just kind of paint on as a top coat and cover the entire set. Depending on how you're planning on finishing this set, this second coat might not be necessary. Just the first coat will give you kind of a semi-rigid shell that you can sculpt on top of. But I want mine to be a little bit harder. I'm going to be finishing this with a water clay, so it's going to be nice to have a little extra support underneath. So here's the fully dried piece. One of the only downsides to this process is it does take a while to dry. This took about 3 days drying time. It probably didn't help that it's the middle of winter and it's raining. If I could have set it outside in the sun, it probably could have been done in about a day. But at this state, it's definitely durable enough to sculpt a layer of clay on the top. And here's where I left the little cutout for the tree. This will also let me sink it deeper into the ground if I think that would look better. I actually really like the final look of the burlap. It's got kind of this earthy texture that I think would look really good in front of camera. And when it dried, it left this kind of bumpy texture here. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's a cool look. But unfortunately for this project, it's just not going to work, but it's definitely something I'll keep in mind for future projects. So now on to the little mountain range in the background. I started by cutting out 5 mountains using the 2-inch bead foam, the same foam that I used for the ground, and with a file I just kind of rounded out the tops. And I ran out of my burlap bags, so I had to go to the fabric store and buy some new burlap. So I cut this burlap into long strips that would cover the entire piece of foam, and pretty much just did the same thing with the Elmer's glue and water. Dipped the burlap into the bucket, squished it around a bit, pulled it out, and then just laid it across the top of the foam. I raised the foam off the ground just using a 2x4 with some dowels sticking out of it into the foam. And then after I had the burlap pieces on, I kind of tilted the 2x4 forward. I kind of shimmed it up in the back. And this just kind of makes the whole piece lean forward, so the fabric kind of flares out a little bit to give it a little bit of a slope on the mountain. And then I took some of those air pouch packaging things and kind of squished them up into the top to give the mountains a little bit more shape. I made 5 different hill shapes. I don't really have the layout figured out yet, but this should definitely give me enough pieces to come up with something that looks good. I also sprayed a little bit of expandable foam inside. This just helps make it a little bit more structurally sound. Definitely get by without this. I just had some extra in the cans that I used earlier, so I might as well use it. Then I made some tiny trees to go on top of the mountains. These are made with aluminum wires that I clamped to the tabletop and then just braided into tree patterns. And I'm not getting too crazy with the branch configurations. Really, these are just going to be seen as silhouettes, so I'm kind of just focusing on a silhouette that would be recognizable as a tree. I like to use long skinny pieces of tinfoil and kind of twist and wrap them up the tree and up the branches almost like it's a piece of tape. When you use a lot of little short pieces, a lot of the times you get this problem where you have these little pieces of tinfoil kind of sticking out and flapping around. So the long pieces will prevent that, and it also will kind of give you a nice twisty organic shape. I always have an industrial sized roll of tinfoil in the studio. It's a great material for bulking things up. It's very easy to kind of squish around and get into the shape you want, and it's very easy to sculpt on top of with different types of clays. And it's also relatively inexpensive compared to other materials. So after I tighten up all the tinfoil, I coat the entire thing with Elmer's glue and then hang it up to dry. Elmer's glue is another thing that I always have around in the studio. It's super cheap, about $15 for one of those big jugs, and it's totally versatile. I use it for all sorts of things. So moving on to painting the mountains. The color I'm mixing up for the base layer here, it's kind of a bluish gray. Most of the time when I'm painting a set piece, the base layer will be a much darker brown or even black. But in this case, the mountains are supposed to be really far away, so what I'm doing here is just knocking the contrast down a bit with the gray, and I'm adding a tint of blue. Not only do things lose contrast as they kind of recede into the distance, but they also reflect the colors in the atmosphere a little bit. So the skies in this piece are yellow and blue. That's why I'm adding a little bit of blue to the base coat, and then the tops of the mountains will have a little bit of yellow. And I'm also cutting down the contrast on the trees as well and painting them a darker gray instead of a black. So for the top coat on the mountains, I'm just adding a little bit of yellow to a white, and again the yellow is just kind of highlighting some of the colors in the sky. And I'm just using a really big house painting brush here along with house paints and really just kind of putting it on thick. But I'm not doing a complete coat. I'm letting some of the blue underneath kind of pop through. Here I'm just kind of hoping that this will give a little color variation and texture. But it is possible that I won't really see any of this detail. All of this stuff will definitely be a little bit more blurry than the foreground. But I always find that I'm kind of overbuilding all my set pieces. This way, if the situation arises where we do want to see the texture, it's there if we want it. So here's how the little mountain range will be staged in the background of this set. And this is an example of something called forced perspective. What I did with the trees is I made each one slightly smaller as they go back in space. And what this does is exaggerate the illusion that everything gets smaller as it recedes into the background. It's a very subtle amount of cheating perspective. If I really wanted to get some extreme perspective, I could have made these trees in the background just like 1 or 2 inches. Then it would have really looked like everything was receding far back. Here's the back side of all the little mountains, and you could see that I just used some of the expandable foam and glued on this little wooden handle that conveniently clamps into the C-stand here. So they're all adjustable. I could slide them to the left and to the right. And you could also see that each one of the trees in the back, I epoxied this little metal rod onto it so it can just basically slide into the set and stick in the foam pretty easily. I won't really be able to put this whole little puzzle together until it's actually in front of camera with the correct lens. The lens is really going to determine how far apart and how high and low these things are. So later on I'll have some more videos when we light and photograph this set. I always enjoy the lighting part of this process. Good lighting could really make a set look 1,000 times better. If you liked this video, I would really appreciate it if you shared it or liked it or even left a comment. All that stuff helps YouTube's algorithm get the video out to a wider audience. So thanks for stopping by, and until next time.
Don't